Hi there, this is Mr. A, and I'm going to show you the way to use these different hundreds grids to create decimal values. So let's have a look at the first hundreds grid up over here. And if we're looking at the hundreds grid, we can say that we have two columns shaded in, two columns with 10 squares in each column. And that means we have 10 and 20 squares if we're skip counting. Now, since we have 20 squares that are shaded in, that's like saying that we have 20 cents in total. And actually, it's probably better if I do this. If we have 20 cents in total out of 100 cents that we could have in our whole dollar. And our whole dollar could be represented by the hundreds grid, because we know that we have, in a dollar, we have 100 cents. Now, the easiest way to make a decimal from that is to say that, hey, we don't have a whole dollar, so we don't have a dollar, we have $0, and that's going to give us a 0, and then we need a decimal point there, and then we can put 2, 0, because we have 20 cents. And that 20 comes from the 20 squares that are shaded in. We have $0 and we have 20 cents. Or you can think of it as being we have two groups of 10. Those two groups of 10 are the different columns that are shaded in again. Let me clear some of that away because it's getting a little bit messy. So take out that error. There we go. Now, if we go to our next hundreds grid down over here, we can see that we have, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 squares shaded in. Now, that means that we have 25 cents. Now, we know that 25 cents is actually like a quarter because we actually have a coin. We actually have a coin that's called a quarter that's worth 25 cents. And we know that we need 1, and let me change the color, 2, 3, and maybe we'll erase this, and 4 different quarters to make up our dollar. Now, in this case, we only have 1 quarter shaded in. So again, we can say when we're making our decimal, we don't have a whole dollar. So we have 0. Then we put our decimal point, and we can say that we have 25 squares or 25 cents of the whole dollar, which is, again, our squares that are shaded in there. Let's clear some of this away so that it's a little easier to see what's going on. Okay, there we go. But let's leave our nice red line so that we can see that it's divided up into quarters, because that makes it easier to understand for everybody. So we have 25 cents there. Now, if we go down to our next hundreds grid down at the bottom here, we can see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different columns that are shaded in. And we know that in each one of those columns we have 10 squares. So let's skip count together. We have 10. Oops. Let's try that again. We have 10, 20, 30, 40. We have 50. We have 50 squares shaded in. So that's like saying we have 50 cents out of the 100 cents that we need to make a dollar. Now, we can make a decimal by saying, we don't have a dollar, so we put the 0, and we have 50 cents there. And the 50 comes from the 50 squares that are shaded in. Now, each of these different hundreds grids and decimals, we can easily make a fraction out of these by saying, well, how many cents do we have out of the whole dollar? How many cents do we actually have shaded in out of the whole dollar? Now, the top part of the fraction that we're going to make is always called the numerator. The numerator is the number that is shaded in, the number of the whole or the parts of the whole that we actually have. In this case, we're talking about perhaps a dollar. So if we look at our first decimal up over here, we have 20 squares that are shaded in. So we can say that we have 20 out of 100 different squares that are shaded in. The 20 comes from, and let me change my colors here, the 20, again, this comes from the squares that are shaded in. And our number on the bottom, which is called a denominator, this comes from our whole. And we've already said that our whole here, our hundreds grid, has 100 different squares, or if you want to look at it in terms of money, it has 100 cents. And in this case, we only have 20 squares out of our whole 100 squares that are shaded in. Now, if we go to our next 100 grid down here, where we have a quarter, we know that we have 25 squares that are shaded in, or you can say that we have 25 cents. And we know that in our whole, which is going to give us the denominator, we have 100 squares. So right there we've made a fraction. We said that we have 25 squares shaded in, which comes from the parts that are shaded in there, the 25 squares, and we have 100 squares in total. So 25 out of, let's take that out, maybe change the color. 25 out of 100 squares are shaded in. And there we have another fraction. Let's go down to our bottom grid, which has 50 squares shaded in, down over here. Now, we can again say that now we have, well, our numerator is going to be 50 because we have, in total, we have 50 squares that are shaded in. Or again, if you're thinking in terms of money, we can say that we have maybe 50 cents. Now, again, our whole, there are 100 squares in our whole, so our denominator is going to be 100. There we go. And so we have 50 cents out of 100, or we can say we have 50 cents out of $1. That's a different way of looking at it if it helps you think about decimals and fractions. Now, we've made, so far we've made, for each one of these, we've made a decimal, right, for each, and we've made a fraction over 100 for each decimal value. Now, here comes the equivalent fraction part. We can look at these in some different ways, and I'm going to try to clear off some space. Well, you know what, let's not do that. Let's leave it the way it is and see what we can do. So here we start off with 20 over 100, and we're going to try to make some equivalent fractions for that. So, and that means, equivalent means, again, things that are the same value. So we want to make fractions that are the same value as 20 over 100. Now, the easiest way to do that is to say, hey, well, look, I have, over here I have one group of 10. I have two groups of 10. And if I count all the groups of 10 here, I have 10 groups of 10 in my whole hundreds grid. Only two groups of 10 are shaded in out of 10 groups of 10. That means we can make a fraction saying that our hundreds grid is two groups of 10 that are shaded in, which is our numerator on top, out of, ooh, that looks like a 4, that's confusing. Let's take that out. There we go. We have two groups of 10 shaded in, out of 10 groups of 10 in the whole grid. Okay, let's erase that, make some more room. Now, if we clean up our hundreds grid, and let's do that so it's a little easier to work with, because it's getting awfully messy and awfully confusing. Just really quickly do that. There we go. Nice clean hundreds grid. Much easier to look at. Now we had two groups of 10 shaded in out of a total of 10 groups of 10 in the whole thing, right? Now, we can also look at the hundreds grid in different ways. We can divide it up. So let's say we did this. If I divide it up into groups of 20, let's see how many groups of 20 that we can make when we divide up our hundreds grid. Well, let's count now. I've made some groups of 20. Let's see how many groups of 20 we have in total. We have the one over here. That's our two groups of 10. 2, 3, 4, and 5. We have 5 groups of 20 in our hundreds grid. Now, if we look, we only have one group of 20 that's shaded in. And we have another 4 that aren't. Well, we can easily make a fraction from that again. We can say that, well, look, inside of our hole we have one group of 20 that are shaded in, one group of 20 squares, and there are, in total, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups of 20 in the hole. So we got our numerator on top from the group of 20 that's shaded in, and we got our denominator on the bottom from the total number of groups of 20s in our whole hundreds grid, which is 5. We have 5 groups of 20 in 100. So we found that out just by drawing lines through our hundreds grid and trying to group things in different ways. If we look at our next fraction, which is a quarter, we can see that, well, if we look at this, if we look at our hundreds grid, and let's clear it off again a little bit to make it a little bit easier to see, because it's getting a little bit messy. And Mr. Mello does not like messy, because that just gets confusing. So let's clear that off. And we'll change colors. Okay, so we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We had a square like this over here of 25 squares shaded in, and then we had these other squares that were empty. Well, if we look at our hundreds grid, we can see that it's divided into 4 different groups here. We have one group of 25, 2 groups of 25, 3 groups of 25, and 4 groups of 25. Well, I think we all know a fraction that we might be able to make from that, because we can see that, and on the side of our hole here, we have 4 groups, 4 equal groups, and we only have one group that's shaded in. So right away we know that our numerator can be 1 on top, because we have one group of 25 that's shaded in, and our denominator on the bottom can be 4, because inside of 100, just as inside of $1, we have 4 groups of 25. Or that's like saying we have 1, 2, 3, 4 quarters to make up the dollar, which is up over here. In this case, well, we only have the 1 quarter, and that's why we have a 1 up here. Let's clear that away again, because it's getting awfully messy. Okay. Now, if we look at our last one, our last hundreds grid at the bottom, we have, in this case, 50 cents out of 100. And if we actually look at our grid, well, I can see that about half the squares are shaded in, exactly half. Because we know that 50 plus 50 equals 100. So there are many different fractions that we can make from that, but the simplest one that we can make is, well, I have half. I have one part of 50, one group of 50, out of the 2 different groups of 50 that it takes to make 100. Now, we can make a whole bunch of equivalent fractions to 1 over 2 just by doubling. And we can do that like this. Well, we can say that, well, if we double 1, that becomes 2. If we double 2, that becomes 4. And we know that 2 plus 2 is 4, so 2 is still half of 4. So we know that these two guys, these 2 fractions here, they're exactly the same. Now doubling works the same way up over here. Up here I have 1. If I double 1, I get 2. If I double 4, I get 8. And 2 over 8 is the same as 1 over 4, because I have 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. I have 4 groups of 2 inside of 8, and in this case, well, I only actually have 1 group of 2. So that's saying that we have 2 out of 8.